over to Dan.
Thank you. Is this on? Excellent. Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to everyone who organized. I feel like about a quarter of this room has been on my podcast, which is cool. And Adam is the guest on my next episode, which is excellent. Yeah, listen up, because you're going to hear Adam on Sunday. We have a great panel here today. I'm going to introduce everyone, and then we're going to get into it. To my left, my immediate left, is Carlos Garcia, who was born in Cananea, Sonora, in Mexico, and migrated to Arizona at age 5. Carlos co-founded Puente, an immigrant rights organization, and has been its executive director since 2011. He also helped found One Arizona, a nonprofit coalition focused on civic engagement, and he was a key player in defeating former Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio, really one of the worst human beings on earth, and in challenging the notorious racial profiling law, SB 1070. Today, he is a Phoenix City Council member for District 8. At the one down, I'm going to keep this somewhat short since you got a lengthy introduction this morning. Maurice Mitchell is a nationally recognized social movement strategist and organizer for racial, social, and economic justice. And Maurice took the helm of the Working Families Party as national director in 2018. Then to Maurice's left is Brandon Johnson, who has been a public servant for nearly 20 years. After working his way through college, Brandon taught social studies and reading in Chicago public schools at Jenner Academy Elementary and Westinghouse College Prep. It was at Jenner in the Cabrini Green neighborhood that Brandon's passion and commitment to social and economic justice peaked. While his students were bright, energetic, and full of promise, they lived in a neighborhood struggling to survive under the weight of poverty and high levels of unemployment and violence. In 2011, Brandon joined the resurgent Chicago Teachers Union as an organizer. Brandon helped to organize the monumental 2012 CTU strike, which laid the groundwork, of course, for the CTU strike going on right now, and fought against the onslaught of closings and privatization in Black and Latinx schools. Most recently, Brandon has coordinated coalition campaigns with parent and community organizations to pass state legislation for an elected representative school board, stronger oversight of private charter school operators, restoring collective bargaining rights for teachers, and an elimination of tax breaks and slush funds for the 1%. Brandon recently ran for public office and won on a dynamic platform that included expanding public accommodations, protecting workers' rights, and demanding that the wealthy pay their fair share in taxes. He is currently Cook County Commissioner for the 1st District. At the very end, and I haven't said hello to you yet, hello, welcome, is Julia Daniel, who is on the leadership team of Showing Up for Racial Justice. She is also a PhD candidate in Educational Foundations, Policy and Practice at the University of Colorado Boulder. She is committed to community organizing, having organized in Miami, Florida around issues of racial, gender, and economic justice with Power U Center for Social Change. Most of this work centered on ending the school to jailhouse pipeline for Black and Latinx youth, by working with impacted young people in demanding alternatives, such as restorative justice, as well as fighting for affordable housing and reproductive justice. All right, to start off, my first question is a pretty basic one, which is what you all see to be the key tasks for the left in terms of building power at the local level, and how are you going about building it? And I'm gonna start with Carlos, who I know has a short video as part of his answer. It's a city, of course, Phoenix. It's become synonymous with anti-immigrant politics in recent decades, thanks to former Sheriff Joe Arpaio. And so in particular, I'm curious to hear how organizing against the nativist police state that's been put in place in the heart of Arizona, how that relates to building a multiracial working class left governing coalition that not only ends this bipartisan war on immigrants that began well before Trump, but that also transforms the larger political and economic system that gave rise to it in the first place.
Awesome. Okay. Mike good? Mike?
I think you're on.
Yeah, I'm on? Okay. So I know it's been a long day for everyone, and so I wanted to bring a little little bit of Arizona into the room, because I don't know how familiar you are. This is a short video that we created, and it's a lot based on 2010, which was when SB 1070 came to place, which was really a point in history, or in recent history in Arizona, that kind of shifted where the politics of the state were going. But I wanted to bring some of that in, so bring some context to what I'm saying.
We don't want you here. If you don't salute my flag and honor it as I do, I don't want you here.
We now have room for 2,500.
All right.
And we'll put tents up from here to Mexico.
We've been here for 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, we actually seen 3 border patrols, 1 police car. Right now, you see a border patrol just pass. Imagine all the fear that people have to go through, just walking, seeing a border patrol.
I don't want you here.
The message to Mexico is, you come into Maricopa County and you are here illegally, you're going to jail. We have enough laws to do that. I don't need the new law.
¿Y qué te decía el policía?
Nada, que me callara, pero no podía porque quería mi mami.
What is this about? A lot of people think that it's about crime. But if you look at the data, we know that it's not about crime. That is that immigrant populations produce less crime or fewer crime than actually the regular population in America. People think that this is about the fact that undocumented people take more out of the economy than they put in, and there's well-documented research that actually shows that they put in more money into the economy in the long run than they take out. So these issues are not, it's not about that. So the question remains, well, what is this about?
We are asking everybody to start nonviolent civil disobedience because no one is listening anymore. Education, not deportation! 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 Education, not deportation!
Just because, sake of time, but. So, in Arizona, it's obviously a place that's been colonized by 2 countries, right? It was first Mexico, then the United States. It's a place that was also part of the South. And so both slavery and colonization hit right in the middle. And in 2010, we had Sheriff Arpaio, Jan Brewer, who was the governor, and a county attorney, all white folks who came to Arizona in a wave of people that moved there to kind of create a haven, without taking into consideration the people who had been there for a long time. And so for 20 years, they figured out ways to get rid of us. It was one, to physically trap us and use the existing criminal justice system and expand it to force multiply and detain, cage, and deport as many people as possible. And the other was this war of attrition, which was to pass as many laws as possible to make our lives miserable, so miserable that we self-deport, taking education, driver's license, so on, social services and all that. And so when we started doing the work, when I personally started doing this work after college in 2007, Sheriff Arpaio was in office, 85% approval rating. He was what Trump is in the sense of being a populist, and everybody in Maricopa County in Arizona loved him, right? And so that's the context in which we started organizing. And so the first things we had to do, it wasn't just battling him, but it was battling the idea of you're safe when you're in the hands of someone like Sheriff Arpaio. And so in order to combat that, we had to take out every tactic in the book, from hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, civil disobedience, some of the things you saw out there, lawsuits, anything we could think of, because we were literally fighting for our survival. Like I said, I was born in Mexico, grew up undocumented, had 6 people in my family go through incarceration and deportation proceedings. 5 of them were deported, 1 of them we were able to fight to get them here. And so it was something that we were literally fighting for our families. In how we fought, we were able to create space and create different trajectories. There was obviously the civil disobedience, the legal arm, and then there's also an electoral politics side. The numbers weren't there. They didn't exist, right? They were overwhelmingly Republican majority in every level of government. And so there was also a whole arm, which was the one Arizona, to register and change the electorate. Shortening it up, without being able to tell you the history, we did change the political landscape and created space and openings for politics to change. The city of Phoenix local government being one of them. But what ended up happening is we created this space, and yes, Democrats were elected, but it wasn't the people that fought or had created the shift that got rid of outright racism, which was Sheriff Arpaio. And so then we went on for, soon after this, when we were able to shift things, having to fight Democrats now, right? To say literally the person that replaced this sheriff was a Democrat who is now doing the exact same things. So short after Trump, we decided to start taking power ourselves. And so my race being one of the first, we also ran people for judges in different places, but it was this unapologetic, calling things for what they were, shifting, and trying to teach people how government can actually not only be accountable to movement, but be part of movement. And so the folks that ran for office were literally people that had an agenda that came from movement and were in service of movement, were service of an agenda of the people that were fighting back to get rid of these folks. And that's where we end up now. Been in council for 5 months, and we'll continue to like push that side of it.
Maurice, Carlos was talking about how this immigrant rights movement that exploded in Arizona in response to SB 1070 and Arpaio, how that ultimately built so much power that not only did they get rid of Arpaio, but Carlos is on council. Today, the WFP candidate that I'm perhaps most excited about is Kendra Brooks in Philly, who I met years ago when I was reporting on the mass struggle against austerity, school closures, and privatization there. And she was a grassroots leader in Nicetown, a neighborhood in Northwest Philly, if I remember correctly. And both with Brooks and with public schools activist Helen Jim, who's on city council in Philly as an at-large member right now, we see this grassroots left that was taking shape in response to the Tea Party moment about a decade ago, but that was getting much less attention from the Tea Party at the time, now having created this new bench of left leaders who are just starting to take power now. How do you see that on both in Philly in particular, because I have a particular interest in Philly, and on the national level?
Sure. A few things. So I'll respond to Philly, and then I'll talk a little bit nationally. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what's taking place in Philadelphia, so it's actually like a kind of interesting law that exists in some Northeast municipalities where there's set-asides in the city council for the minority party, which effectively, because we have a pretty entrenched two-party system, it's legally setting aside seats for the Republican Party. That's the impact of it, right? And it's actually like a very useful tool for the sort of transactional politics of the sort of Democratic Party, because you have like a pressure release valve, because you have a minority Republican grouping that could be your foil when you don't want to sort of respond to grassroots movements, and you always have a foil. You always could say, like, we tried as hard as we can, but these damn Republicans on the city council won't allow us to pass like real rent reform or other municipal sort of advances that our movements have been pushing for, or to become a sanctuary city, or anything that they might view as being a concession that they don't want to kind of go for. Usually it's concessions that will actually challenge their relationships with capital, right? So we are a political party, and so we figured we actually could challenge the Republicans as the minority party in strong democratic cities like Philadelphia. And so that's currently what we're doing this cycle with Kendra Brooks and Nicholas O'Rourke, who come from grassroots movements. Kendra, who's born and raised in Philly and been on the front line challenging sort of the privatizations of schools, and Nick, who's been on the front lines of sort of the movement for Black Lives. And so both of them are just weeks away from hopefully sweeping the Republicans off of the city council. And Helen Gim, who is a left Democrat, the three of them would form a bloc, a true left bloc in the Philly City Council, and it'll be a pretty if and when that happens, right? Let me just name it. The impact will be pretty significant in terms of the municipal politics of Philadelphia, and so for a major city to go through that transformation in one cycle is pretty significant. Now, to me, what that means, that's the byproduct to me of social movements and the work that's taken place. I think there's been work that's been bubbling up. I think the movements of the past 2 years, the immigrant rights movement, Occupy, the movement for Black Lives, there's like a shift in the political consciousness and almost the political DNA in this country that is more attuned. I remember like there was years ago, but more attuned to popular movements sort of bubbling up in response to the lack of responsiveness of the state. I remember years ago, there were these memes. It was like the pre-meme. I've been organizing pre-meme, so. It's funny, every single thing you do is now recorded. I remember an era where that wasn't the case. It was a glorious era. So,
We're being live streamed.
Yeah. I remember there was whatever the prehistoric version of a meme was, but there was this juxtaposition of people and workers in France who protest more regularly, and challenge almost any inch. They don't give up an inch on any of their rights, and there's just sort of like, look at us, we're apathetic. I feel like something has shifted in our consciousness, and our social movements have had an impact on the just popular awareness of people's ability to kind of take action. And I think one of the things that we're attempting to do with the Working Families Party is to figure out how we consolidate that into an organized party sort of structure. And how do we take these different streams, social movements, which aren't the traditional institutions, don't necessarily care about Section 501C or 501 of the tax code, right? But are certainly organizations, but metamorphosize and change in their politics. So they're just very different. How do we engage social movements? How do we engage individuals that are becoming politicized, but not necessarily organized in this moment? How do we engage sort of folks in traditional worker organizations like labor institutions, so the labor left? And how do we engage people who are doing the traditional day in, day out grassroots organizing? So those are 4 different types of forces that are coming together in the Philly race, because all of those forces, grassroots organizations, organizations like Power, and organizations like, there's a long list. I'm not even going to go into them, right? And labor locals, right, who represent within those labor institutions a lot of contradictions are throwing down for Kendra and Nick. Individuals who have been politicized by our movements but aren't part of any traditional organization, and then social movements, like folks from the movement for Black Lives, like folks from other institutions, and then organizations like DSA are all throwing down on this race. So how do we use these races as opportunities, not just events and moments for folks to throw down, but opportunities to consolidate and congeal these forces into what would be functionally a party, right? Political parties are a number of things. One of the things that political parties are a combination of forces that engage in electoral sort of united front efforts. And Kendra and Nick's race are an example of that. I think Carlos's race is an example of that. And we were very, very proud to both endorse Carlos and then provide support on a number of levels, both coordinated support and then independent support to Carlos's race. And I think nationally, what we just described, that's happening in small and big ways everywhere. And so part of the work that I'm attempting to do, I just got here, right? I'm more than a year into taking the helm of the Working Families Party, and the Working Families Party is about 21 years old. Part of what I'm attempting to do, like my central organizing challenge, is how do we create the conditions so those 4 different sets of left power could engage and struggle together, engage in meaningful internal democracy together, and then be able to, in these moments in elections, engage in united front efforts together. Understanding that there are tensions around that, there are meaningful and what I hope to be generative disagreements amongst those forces, but ultimately, because there's so much in common, there's a willingness and a desire to stay together in a party formation before, during, and after an election. The last thing I'll say is that if we do that, and if we do that well, then win or lose, we're building power, we're building durable power. Because either we're building a muscle so that we're building our ability to form solidarity across those institutional lines, across race and across difference, which is useful in any scenario. And we're also building a base of people who are ready to flank folks like Carlos and flank folks like Kendra and Nick. And then also, the reality is, like, when you take somebody who is a left revolutionary and you put them in a conservative legislative body, there's limitations to what they're able to do. And there's a conservatizing impulse or a center of gravity when they feel that like they're alone. And so winning with a party structure and a base means that that individual is protected and buttressed against the conservatizing sort of forces that try to drag them into the transactional sort of realities of being in a legislative body that's controlled by Democrats, right? And like the last thing I'll say is that I think the broader effort, one of the things that we're attempting to do, and it's ambitious, is that we're attempting to figure out if it's possible to basically eviscerate the Republican Party as a national political project, so that, and the way that we want to experiment in the places that because of the demographics and everything else are essentially Democratic towns, if we could basically eliminate the Republican Party as a true political actor, so that the 2 poles, if we're going to deal with the entrenched two pole system, the 2 poles are the Democrats and the left, and that we could be effectively the electoral expression of the left, and using the Democratic primary as a site of struggle in order to have that conversation and to contest that, versus the contestation being Democrat-Republican. So,
thanks. Brandon, how has this all played out in Chicago? Obviously, policing, public schools, economic inequality have long been major points of conflict and debate here, with Laquan McDonald's murder and the 2012 CTU strike being particularly salient touchstones. Those movements, specifically CTU's history, have now put you into elected office. On the other hand, we have businesses' preferred candidate, Lori Lightfoot, winning the election this year and sitting in the mayor's office right now fighting the CTU. What's happening in Chicago in terms of this relationship between movements and electoral politics? Where did it come from? Where's it at now? And where do you see it heading?
Yeah, those are good questions. And so I'm really grateful to be here. For those of you who are not from Chicago, welcome. You picked an exciting time to be here. Please pardon. I normally don't sound like a raspy preacher, though it's ironic because my father and grandfather were both pastors, and both of them, of course, were not union positions. And so here I am. But I'm really inspired, honestly, by what Maurice has articulated in Carlos's story. Just hearing that briefly, I just think the bottom line for not just Chicago, but what we are experimenting with or even pushing towards is the idea of the grassroots movement in the left one, not being afraid to push the electoral space, but also holding on to our true values as a movement. Because quite frankly, as a social studies teacher and a believer, when you look through history, we all know that there's nothing really new under the sun. I know we all want to feel dynamic, like we are the brand new it. But there have been similar configurations of this before. And so the hope is that we learn from what folks have done in previous generations, and that we take a hard look of where we are. So let's not be afraid, as some of our brothers and sisters on the left are, to move into the electoral space, because it can be a little nasty and you can get co-opted, as Maurice alluded to. But also recognizing that even if you elect people like me, you can't leave me there, not by myself. And I'll give you a specific example and just put a pin there, and I promise I'll come back to that. But as far as like this sort of I don't know, collection of bad, whether it be the privatization of schools, the policing, the poor policing, and the overemphasis of policing, has been a really unique space for the movement to converge. But it's also been a place of tension, because when you are pushing, particularly through education justice lens, while also recognizing that our students are being murdered and harassed at the hands of the state, that you have public educators who see a more radical vision of the world for public schools, but they might be married to cops. And so this is where the conundrum is, I think sometimes, that we have to be thoughtful about. It doesn't mean that we capitulate. It doesn't mean that we have to make excuses or to be conservative in terms of how we actually pursue justice. But these are just realities. And what we've seen, though, in Chicago is that a very unique opportunity where the struggle to see, like, our lives matter, Black lives in particular. And you see that play out not just in how neighborhoods are occupied and over-policed, you're seeing that in the disinvestment of our public schools. You're also witnessing that in terms of unemployment, which has reached Great Depression era numbers, particularly with demographics of Black men. And so you have this convergence. But the problem that we've had in Chicago, and I think this is also what Maurice was getting at, we have not really built the muscle for the collide that we had in 2012. So we were literally training and performing at the same time. So that might explain either my voice or the fact that this jacket used to fit me in 2012. So that's been the challenge, right? Because, you know, we haven't had a teacher strike at that point for 25 plus years. But here we are today is because you had a very active faction within a teachers union that began to question, as Dr. King would say, all matters of society, calling for a radical redistribution of political power and economic power when we shift from the civil rights to the human rights movement. And so as we begin to raise questions of all things, then it was less about just wages and benefits. It was about securing wraparound services for our students, making sure that there are health clinics in our neighborhoods, really challenging the city's budget, where $100 million was going into overtime alone with just policing, where this so-called mayor, progressive mayor, we should just stop calling her that. Just the current mayor has just appropriated another $30 million for policing, while we are literally begging or about to take arrests for social workers, counselors, and nurses. So the imagination of a Chicago that all children deserve started out with what type of school system do we want? And then it began to grow into what type of Chicago do we want? And so as that movement began to grow, we begin to find ourselves obviously at odds with the power structure, where because there had not been an attempt to push our vision and values electorally, no one knew if it was okay to be afraid of our movement yet. People just knew we had a lot of good ideas, but no one really knew if you could actually execute those ideas. And the only way, of course, you can prove that in some instances is you got to go after people. So I'll close with these last 2 points. Remember the pen that I put in something. Don't let me forget whatever that was. But we had the strike in 2012. The mayor of Chicago at that time, Rahm Emanuel, turned right around the next year and closed down record number of schools, the largest number of schools in the history of America, which is just dramatic in and of itself. By 2014, we realized we had to do something different. So we wanted to push for more democracy in our education system. So there was a black woman on the south side of Chicago who really became the first person to move on a message that was speaking directly to the interests of workers and communities. Her name is Jay Travis. Ran against a Cory Booker type. I'll just cut to it. Right? So you know the type, right? And bless his whole heart, by the way, as my mama would say. And we lost, though, to this character. But the Crown family, all the wealthy billionaires, millionaires had to pour money into his candidacy. And he was sort of the rising star politically because of just, he fit the profile. You know the profile. It don't look like me. All right, I just started wearing blazers 11 months ago. I'd be like, Carlos, just keep it real. They make you shave and everything, my goodness. But though we lost, what was interesting in that district, the entire black side of the district voted for our candidate. And so we had a black woman running on a progressive platform, and you know what her major platform was? Protecting pensions. Now, Maurice is probably like cringing on the inside because that is not the message you run on. It's protecting pensions, right? But we wanted to see like how far we can push the conversation around what people actually care about. And so that was important, though we lost that race, to set us up for future races. And so what happened as we collide all of these struggles together with policing, school privatization, much like how the extreme right began to do what they did to get who they got in the White House, we knew that we had to start provoking, and I'm just fast forwarding, at a very local level. Can you win on a dynamic message where you take on school privatization, you take on over-policing, you take on austerity in a black district with a black person running on a dynamic message? And so we wanted to see if we could do it. And so, of course, I got tagged, and so they said, you're it. And the district that I ran in, what's fascinating, though, is that we still have a lot of work to do because my district is 55% city, 45% suburban. It's a microcosm of Illinois. Some of the wealthiest folks, you know how these districts look. Wealthy folks on one end, extreme abject poverty on one end. And having been through this a couple of times with Jay Travis, another sister named Tara Stamps, we knew that our best shot to get a left progressive candidate in office, didn't matter what office it was, that we needed to have not just a dynamic platform, but we needed a scenario in which we can actually win. The truth of the matter is, y'all, when it comes to left and building the left movement, if we cannot build a radical left movement in Black America, I do not believe you have a movement. Just gonna be quite frank with you. You know, after Reconstruction, you know, it's all the same issues, right? After Reconstruction, public education, transportation, housing, healthcare, and none of that has changed. And so what we found was, we knew in the black part of the district, the Chicago side, we're gonna have a tough time. We ran against, by the way, I don't know if you guys know who Congressman Danny Davis is. Well, I ran against his chief of staff, his former chief of staff. So in Black America, everything black is politics. Your pulpits, your businesses, the elected officials. So when you're running against someone, you're running against the entire institution. So you can't even get into churches. That's how difficult it is to even give your stump speech. You can't knock on doors. It's very difficult. Long story short, in the black part, the city side in particular, I actually lost that section of the district. 47%, which was the exact number that Jay Travis got on the south side twice, and then another sister by the name of Tara Stamps. But what we were able to do, though, was, though we only got 47%, we won one of the black wards, which ironically was actually one of the poorest black wards in the entire district, where I believe the United Nations described this place in Chicago, it's called Garcia Park, as a developing nation. It's just that poor there. But the folks that we were able to win, honestly, were in the western suburbs, still black folks out there, different education level. And what we said to people was, and this is what we experienced as we collide all this together, we ran against a dude who was tied to school privatization, and he was calling for the United Nations to come into Chicago to deal with the violence. Now, even though the county government has no oversight of education, we said, let's run on it anyways. So we basically said, not only do we need to make sure we protect public services, we got to protect the rights of workers, we got to make the wealthy pay their fair share in taxes, and we hit him on his stance on policing. We hit him on his stance on school privatization, and there were many black folks that I would speak to throughout that campaign. They would look me in the face, and they would say, young brother, those white folks ain't gonna let you do all that. That's what they would say. And so these are the harsh realities that even though they agree with us, you all, they just don't know like if that message can win. And so the other black part of the district, which is in Maywood, the western suburbs, we did very well there. So it's not like black folks didn't vote for us. In fact, when you talk to the politicals, they would say, one, how did you beat a Cook County commissioner on the issue of education? And Cook County has nothing to do with education. How do you beat a Cook County commissioner on the state of policing, where technically the sheriff handles that? Because we wanted to make sure that people knew what our values were. And we won by 436 votes. And so I'll say this last thing, and this is why it's important that the movement stays in place. Because having been in office for 11 months now, we passed 2 ordinances. One, to eliminate the gang database. We can talk about that later, but it's a very dynamic effort. And then 2, we needed to secure housing for individuals who were formerly incarcerated. And we connected the school homelessness with people who are returning from prison, right? Because 80% of them are women, and they're head of households. But you know why we were able to pass that? It's because the movement didn't go away. And so county government got a taste of what usually your state legislature receives or your city council receives. And so we had all these commissioners who are not used to the movement, but had it not been for the movement on the issue of policing, making sure that education is connected to healthcare, connected to all the issues, and homelessness, it's why we were able to not just win, but begin to govern on our values.
Julia, what's your take on this, particularly with regard to criminal justice? How do you see movement building related to left electoral projects in general, and maybe specifically in terms of electing reform district attorneys? Not to make everything about Philly, but everything should be about Philly. But that's a city where very radical anti-mass incarceration activists played a central role in getting Larry Krasner elected district attorney. And so this is like, I know a number of self-identified prison abolitionists who work to get someone elected to an office where he is decisively breaking from the status quo, but complicatedly is pretty fundamental to his job is still putting people in jail every day. So how do you think about electoral politics and anti-mass incarceration work?
Sure. So SURGE organizes white people to take action against racism. And it was started 10 years ago, and then it got a really huge boost in terms of our numbers around the time of Mike Brown's murder and the Ferguson uprising. And then again, a lot more people kind of came into action during the Trump victory. And that was a lot of like urban, middle-class white people, a lot of college-educated folks who were angry about police murder and just state killings. And so we're driven to that kind of issue. So the criminalization of Black communities, mass incarceration, and yeah, just sanctioned state murders of young Black people. So races like the DA race and Larry Krasner and things like that make a lot of sense because they actually effectively have a lot of power at the local level. And there's sites that can be contested. So we see DAs and prosecutors as well as local county budgets and policing budgets at the local level as important sites of struggle. DAs in particular have a lot of power, and they're in seats that could be flipped pretty easily. There's not a lot of oversight for what they do. They're elected at the county level, and then they operate a lot of times with just basically enormous control over what happens with jail conditions, policing practices, enforcement of drug issues, as well as immigration and detention. And then also, in thinking about organizing white people, a lot of the local jail systems are in low-income white communities. And so we also need to think about who's voting those sheriffs into place, what do they know about those sheriffs, and how can we move them on mutual interest questions, right? How are low-income white people also impacted by the expansion of the prison industrial complex, and how can we get them to divest from voting into things like that? So we see those as really key issue areas and types of struggle.
I want to talk to everyone about the question of how to approach white people in general, working class white people in particular, as part of building a multiracial left governing coalition. But I guess I'll start by asking you a follow-up question, a bit of a tough one, and it reflects some perhaps unfair ideas I have about how Surge operates, and I'm happy to be disabused of them. But there's an idea of like allyship that's pretty pervasive on the liberal left, and it's at least implicitly this idea that implicitly middle class or upper middle class white people are going to act as allies of like oppressed people of color in the fight against white supremacy and against mass incarceration, first and foremost often by teaching white people to identify their privilege. My two questions are, should white people be focusing their organizing implicitly on organizing white middle class people as allies of people of color, or instead, could it make more sense to emphasize organizing working class and poor white people who are also chewed up by mass incarceration to work not so much as allies, but in solidarity with people of color impacted by mass incarceration? And the second question is, there are obviously a lot of good reasons for people of color to organize both separately and in multiracial organizations and in coalitions. But what is the purpose of an explicitly white organization dedicated to organizing white people? Why shouldn't white people be organizing exclusively, at least intentionally, in multiracial organizations? Those are my two tough questions for you.
Cool. I'm glad you asked them. I think in order to win, we need to move working class white people into a progressive platform. I think the right for a long time has done a really good job of targeting low-income white communities, moving particular messages with a very blatant sometimes a little bit more implicit white supremacist lines that really drive home kind of anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, and anti-Black ideas, try to build white racial solidarity, and move people to vote along lines of white racial solidarity. And I think we need to break those folks off, and that means having a very clear class analysis. I agree, and I think Surge's history has been more moving like middle class folks who are ready to go. We haven't had a ton of infrastructure. It's been kind of like moving quickly, so we've run with folks who are ready, and then there's been a shift more recently, and we're trying to move more into mobilizing working class white people in multiracial alliance with communities of color and organizations led by people of color. But I think we need to really address kind of the classism among middle class white people. And so that's funders, that's folks like me from middle class places in the North who have these kind of paternalistic and classist ideas about low income white people that include that they're just more inherently white supremacist or not smart or whatever the thing is. And so I think part of it is challenging those thoughts among people who have those ideas, the middle class folks, and then really investing resources and moving organizing work to be in key places that the South has been organizing, so that the right has been organizing, so moving to the South, moving to rural communities, moving to working class white communities and majority white communities, and engaging people where they're at. So thinking about what are the ways that white supremacy is, and capitalism are exacerbating conditions in their everyday lives, and how do we start from there? So, you know, initial door-knocking conversations that can then move them into taking action to change those conditions, but also to see themselves as working in solidarity with communities of color, and just building up folks' leadership. I think there's been just a deep kind of loss of confidence in low-income communities across the country that we really need to build up folks' sense that they can win things. And so that's, I think, a huge reason why we're in the state that we're in, why Trump wins, why we're losing a lot of places. But then if you look at kind of the Red for Ed movement, or a lot of what's been happening with some of the more radical stuff in places like Arizona or West Virginia, you can see that white people can be organized and mobilized to fight for better conditions, but also start having a more progressive analysis and fight for higher taxes for the wealthy, or changing kind of structural conditions. So that's where we're headed. We have a couple of places where it's been working pretty well, and we're able to uproot sheriffs who are really racist. And in LA, we got a ballot initiative to hopefully move $3.5 million that was slated for jail expansion, and to have that go towards more kind of community healing and better practices. So being on the doors, just working and mobilizing low-income white communities and white people in multiracial communities, I think is the work that's appropriate for white people, because white people will listen to us more. It just makes more sense for us to do that. And I come out of organizing in communities of color, and there was always like these contradictions and problems of doing that. Organizing with white people, I think, is the appropriate space for us to be part of a movement for racial justice.
Brandon and Carlos, as left politicians of color representing multiracial constituencies, how do you think of talking about fitting racial justice into a broader left politics that can appeal and make sense to those different constituencies? Either of you first, whichever.
I could go. When you were talking about your election, it's almost like you were talking about mine. I ran against a person that was there for 12 years and was a cop for 22 years. And we won by 426 votes. Yeah, I mean, having two experiences right now in the last 5 months. One is through the campaign, we took on the police. Phoenix is the deadliest city at the hands of police, shot 47 people last year, killed 27. And already this year, I think we're up 14. And so we're going through that campaigning and seeing both the power and institutional structures and protections that police have built throughout the years, their ability to, anytime I wear to the council meeting and police brutality shirt, they can turn and put in ethics complaints and have, through their Blue Lives Matter BS Facebook stuff, 3,000 emails and just constantly mess with us, right? There's an entire structure to protect the police that we haven't penetrated at all, right? That we haven't penetrated at all, that police is inherently good or whatever. But I went to a meeting last week because one of our duties is zoning. And I went to a meeting, majority of our district is people of color. It's one of only three majority people of color districts. But there's gentrification is moving into one of the traditionally Latinx barrios, Garfield. And it was a local meeting. All people probably live there a couple years, maybe a little bit longer, actively being gentrified. And the topic of the meeting was a Burger King with a drive-thru that was going to move into that neighborhood. I've never seen a more angry mob before in my life. There was literally three white men that stood up and said, "Over my dead body, are you going to build this Burger King drive-thru?" And so to me, it was obviously, wish they did it for people in cages, wish they did it because they lived in the city with the most violent police department in the country. But for whatever reason, they had now felt ownership over this land that is colonized land, but also that they were actively gentrifying. And they, all coming from different backgrounds and from the different parts of the political spectrum, were able to be united over this Burger King not being in their neighborhood. And they're willing to throw everyone under the bus. And they're saying, your Burger King's gonna bring more homeless folks, your Burger King's gonna make the neighborhood stink, your Burger King's gonna bring more traffic. And they had all these arguments, and they're literally even throwing each other under the bus, but they were coalesced under stopping this Burger King. And it really just blew my mind. Obviously Burger King, the zoning developer, everybody walked out and were devastated, and they were gonna lose, obviously, because I sat in the meeting. I was like, you ain't getting this. But we just haven't been able to create or had the ability to create truths of that sort, right? Truths of racial justice, truths of the things we want, right, on our side. And I think the right is very good at not caring about what others think, right? Even here today, we're talking about populism, about trying to make sure we educate, whether it's through surge, like we need to get white people on board, we need to get these folks on board. Very similar in my race, the old school Latinx and old black folks really voted, and that's why it was so hard, went for what they knew, which was a candidate that had been there for a long time. He was a Democrat too, and whatever. And so I think the ability to start leading with truth is what's going to push us through that, right? And not worry about others' fragility. We starting to have conversations about, you know, where police came from slave patrols or union busting. The first deportations were actually the Trail of Tears, and start really being able to start talking in truth and not worrying about people feeling bad or sorry or whatever, but then moving from that into the reality of the policies that have been pushed forward for us to be able to make changes. The loneliness of once you get elected into office is, I can't explain it. I was fortunate enough to bring 3 strong women of color who just are rocking it and doing amazing work. And for some issues, right, for policing, everyone's got our back. People are coming out. When it comes to zoning, when it comes to streets, when it comes to recycling, all these things, we're just not educated or know how gender, race, and class plays a role in all the issues that live in our world, both as elected officials that we're making decisions on, but also how they impact the greater of the community. So to the original question of what does it mean to coalesce, I think a lot of it is issue-based. It's reality-based, and that's where we're not good at, right? Really getting at to the direct impacts that people have every day, and we're good at this kind of meta, like we should all be together. Like, you know, all of us are probably questioning and scratching our heads. Why isn't the left more united than ever? What bigger villain do we need than this president? But it just hasn't happened. And I think most of us were just expecting it for magically to happen, and it hasn't. And so I see it locally and us pushing boundaries, and obviously this idea of eradicating the Republican Party overall. It sounds amazing, and I think if that's kind of a North Star where we could head, it's somewhere we could go, but it definitely starts with locally attaching things to reality. And I think figuring that out is what we need to do.
Brandon,
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. You know, I think the interesting thing about sounds like our stories, again, you have, you know, your traditional voters who tend to go the very conservative route. And so this is interesting because there is, I think, a needed effort to work with other groups, you know, but when I knock doors in black spaces, brown spaces, you can have a conflicting conversation in 7 minutes with 20 different responses to the same question. You know, I'll give you a good example. We need more programs for our young brothers. I want them off the block, and we call police. But I don't want the police harassing them. I mean, and these are very complex issues that, you know, folks within black communities experience. Don't trust the police, but call the police more than anybody else. So that's certainly one challenge. But I think like the real big thing, push and takeaway from this is, you know, building relationships is really important, and doing it the way I believe the folks who reflect, you know, this panel is important, because you just don't know what's ahead. This movement that we've seen in Chicago, at least in this formation, started 10 years ago. If you'd have told me that I was going to be teaching middle school social studies and then 10 years later I would be running for office, I would have never believed you. I wouldn't have. But those relationships really help us for our future endeavors. As our brother alluded to earlier, it's why I said, you don't leave us alone. It is a very lonely place because, excuse me, You know, just the movement has not had a lot of experience in this space in terms of like, very particular response to like white voters in particular. It's a little fascinating in my district because I don't want to admit this, but the numbers don't lie. So white people actually voted for me. In fact, more white people voted for me than, like, that was the highest demographic, honestly. And some of the most wealthiest places in the district voted for me, and I said, I'm gonna tax you. So when our brother talks about telling people the truth, like, there's value in that. But we didn't just say, I'm gonna come and take your money and give it to poor people. Even though that's what we're doing. We're calling for a massive redistribution of wealth. We said our communities are all affected when our people are being locked up and the county has to pay for someone to be locked up, when the county has to pay for someone's health care. You're paying for it anyways. You might as well have a redistribution of the wealth because it saves us all in the long run. But it really takes time, one, again, to build the relationships, to be able to speak truth to power. People found it, I think refreshing that we were being honest about it. And then I think the last thing too is the really neat thing that I've learned about like organizing in white communities is white people's love for olives and cheese. I'm sorry, it's probably not appropriate. I don't know what this has to do with anything. Thank you, sorry. I just lost the white vote.
And you gained two, though.
But I think really what I'm getting at is that what I found fascinating, though, was like individuals' ability to have real organizing conversations about what it means to have racial and economic and social justice. And it turns out people want to be a part of the solution. They just need to know how to get there. So in one regard, you have a group of people saying, man, those white folks, excuse me, are not going to let you do that. And then there's another part of the district, they're saying, look, help us figure out how to do that. And so I think what you were getting at is that because people have had these really bad experiences, it's not so much cynicism, it's just more or less that there's been an enormous amount of doubt just because of people's experiences. I had a town hall a couple weeks ago on Indigenous Peoples Day, and we had it in the more white affluent section of the district. I think there was nearly 60 people there, and these were individuals who said they voted for me, had never met me, and they're glad that they did. And I also had a meeting this morning with 40 black pastors, most of whom wouldn't even allow me in their pulpit, and said this is the most informational meeting we've ever had. Mm-hmm. So it's being direct, it's telling the truth. I'm not hoarding government, here it is. Mm-hmm. Last thing, there was an appropriation for $16 million at the county level for tasers and body cameras. Mm-hmm. I'll just cut to it. I voted against it. What I've learned in 11 months is that when you're having these truthful conversations about the needs that we have in our community, how do I, in good conscience, appropriate $16 million, and some of our communities are just asking for $100,000 to sustain their after-school program. You find $16 million for tasers, and guess what, y'all? It was only 50 of them. I'm like, good grief, I'm glad the graduating class wasn't bigger. So it's telling that truth and being honest and direct with all constituencies, and then being willing to actually lead with that truth.
Maurice, what about you? What do you see as the possibilities and obstacles for a left political majority, given especially what Kathy Cohen was talking about earlier about many white people's continuing commitment to whiteness? Do you see class identity? Do you see that as it being possible to displace whiteness as a commitment with that?
I'm interested in experimenting on the doors around this olives and cheese notion. Perhaps we might see some traction there. It's like, there's olives and cheese under socialism, white people.
Will you give up racism for Chuck Chicory?
Well, I mean, one thing that I look to as being like an interesting statistic that I often talk about is that white evangelicals are 15% of the overall population, but they're 25% of the voting population. And it's a significant delta, significant. If, in fact, like a lot, we do a lot of sort of testing of our electoral practice, and even small sort of shifts. Like if we could prove that through a treatment and control experiment on an election that we could actually move things like 3 percentage points, we're like, oh wow, that's amazing. Let's like invest in that tactic. So I'm fascinated by this 15, 25% thing, right? And to me, what that points to is something that isn't immediate and isn't proximal, but it points to what I think that is probably the outcome of 4 decades of consistent investment in leadership development and political education in those political organizations that we call white evangelical churches, right? And my experience over decades in some of the traditional left organizing spaces is that a lot of those spaces, not all of them, but a lot of those spaces, especially some of the more Alinsky-styled organizing spaces, which tend to be very tactical. And so a lot of the emphasis is on people's ability to do very concrete things and tend to be sort of campaign focused. Ability to do concrete things, so there's the concrete outcome is a very discrete campaign or electoral win, right? And a de-emphasis on ideology and political education. I think that's a huge gap in the U.S. left. And much of the ideological formation that takes place in the U.S. left happen in spaces like this, right? And don't happen with many working class people, not just white working class people, just working class people in general. And we need to re-emphasize political education and popular education so that like the level of rigor of the pedagogy is so sophisticated that everyday people that aren't coming out of academic settings could develop a sophisticated ideological analysis. Over time, I think that's the thing that would be necessary in order to cohere a multiracial alignment of white folks and people of color, where we're not hiding the ball from white folks, right? Where it's a self-aware alignment. I don't think we need majorities of white folks. I think we need a solid 15% of white working class and poor folks to be aligned with majorities of working class people of color. If we could cohere that alignment over time, we could achieve that North Star of breaking the back of the Republican Party. It's not going to be easy, but I think that that's the task. I think that, inherent in your question around surge, yeah, like we don't need any more self-flagellating white liberals, right, who seek to perform allyship and navel gaze in an effort to like undo their personal guilt, right? That doesn't lead us anywhere closer to building that alignment. What we do need to do is I think because it's so challenging and because it's not something that could happen, in an election cycle, it's often, and it's so historically vexing. I think there's a lot of reasons why we don't do it at the level that we need to, but I can't figure out a more important thing for us to do is that political education, not just for white folks, but the developing a political education that coheres that alignment, and so that we could have those conversations at the door. And one of the places where I actually see that happening, and is there are some labor institutions that have been investing in political education, and I have some comrades like that have been doing great work in CWA, for example, where their rank and file membership, it leans white, male, it leans conservative. They have some people who are like hardcore Trump folks, and they're a very progressive, on the progressive end of middle to large sort of unions. They have this very rigorous political education that has actually transformed Trump voters into being like aware and consistent and ideological sort of folks who are engaged in a class struggle with people of color and an intersectional analysis. And so to me, like looking at those current examples, and I've been able to recruit folks from CWA in order to do the ideological work that we're trying to do within Working Families Party, so that we could have those conversations at the door, and then later on have the deep follow-up conversations to make that happen. But I think, you know, it's structural. I think there's a lot of reasons why we've, you know, the U.S. left has a significant ideological gap outside of the academy, but we have to solve for that. We have to be very honest and sober about the fact that that's true.
Before we go to the Q&A, I want to talk about how we extend the local struggles that we've been talking about to the global level and extend our bonds of solidarity beyond U.S. borders. And I want to refer back to Aziz's earlier comments about how domestic reform in this country has for so long been conditioned upon acquiescence to imperialism abroad, and Yarimar's comment about the amazing structural silence about U.S. empire. And Marisa, I'm going to start with my tough question for you, but then I have questions for everyone else. WFP has endorsed Elizabeth Warren, and her foreign policy, as far as I can see from studying it, is a continuation of U.S. empire in general, and she's made some particularly troubling comments about Palestine in particular. Did WFP take foreign policy into consideration, and if so, how?
So, two things. I think that the entire Democratic slate outside of Mike Gravel, I think, to me, has an unsatisfying sort of foreign policy posture and a posture towards U.S. empire. And look, I'm a, you know, I mean, that's just, so that's true. I'm a anti-imperialist, pan-African socialist, and Elizabeth Warren isn't, right? So that's, so I also want to state that. That's a factual statement. The other thing I would say is that I think the fact that the entire Democratic slate, outside of Mike Gravel, I could say that pretty confidently about, speaks to what I think the other panel was referring to, which I think is a place where our movements need to engage around building the same rhetoric and the same sort of mass consensus and sort of left hegemony around empire as we have around Medicare for all or around any of these other issues, right? It's actually the work of not presidential candidates, but left movements to move us into a consciousness where that could be the case. And so to me, it's what you're describing is symptomatic of the work that left movements have yet to do around empire, but must. And particularly around Elizabeth Warren and our relationship to her. So our endorsement of Elizabeth Warren means that inside of her campaign, we struggle around a number of things, this being one of them. Number one. Number two, you know, it's interesting. One of the things that I've noticed about her is that she actually has an ability to respond to movements and shift her consciousness. And some people have seen that, I think, on the negative side as being like not consistent. For me, as somebody who uses the tactics of organizing in order to move folks, it gives me an indication that there's an ability to move the Warren campaign on a number of substantive issues. The last thing I'll say is that, you know, part of our process, you know, was a live stream conversation with each of the candidates. And you all should check out my Cory Booker one. It's hilarious. I also did the one with Elizabeth Warren, and we specifically, it wasn't by chance, we specifically had folks from If Not Now ask her a direct question around the occupation. And, you know, I think we made some news there around her response. She reiterated a response around her opposition to settlements. And then recently, she articulated that she'd be willing to put everything on the table, including no longer providing military aid to Israel around the question of settlements. Again, I think that's an indication of where we are with social movements and social movements' ability. That wasn't, last cycle, that was not a live question. So social movement's ability to move the Overton window and to create these opportunities to move the consciousness so that during in the context of a Democratic primary, these aren't niche questions. These are actually questions that they need to contend with. But so I'm hopeful, but I think that what you're articulating is a gap in an area that we actually need to consolidate around our movements. But and just like the last panel said, we have to have an international perspective, and we'll be catching up with the right. So like Steve Bannon is flying all over the world. So we'll actually be playing catch up in terms of having a rigorous international perspective and practice. And we're making attempts and trying to be as rigorous as possible through our relationships with Barcelona and Comu, and through our relationship with the Labor Party and other left forces in Europe. And I'll be spending some time with left black forces in Brazil and South Africa. In Brazil in November. And so all of these are efforts, I think, to develop that internationalism. But I don't think we're anywhere near where we need to be in order to be effective. I think right now we're at the level of doing interesting and meaningful exchanges, but actually not developing in cross-border practice. So that was a very long answer to your
comprehensive.
Yeah, okay, there you go.
Just respond to that, because I mean earlier when you're having that conversation about international just solidarity and all that, where I live is a very different place than here, and in different parts of the country, the South, the Southwest. We have completely different political context of where we're at. I talked earlier about right now, Phoenix is the only of the top 20 cities in the country, or the 5th largest city in the country, that doesn't have a civilian review board. Doesn't seem like a big deal here, because you're fighting in a different place. The fact that we have no transparency for those 47 people that were shot by police last year is a big deal. And a new political opportunity that opened up 3 months ago, because a black family was pulled out of their vehicle at gunpoint. A pregnant woman with a 1.5-year-old were forced out of their car at gunpoint, opened a political opportunity to maybe finally get a civilian review board that people have been fighting for 30 years. And then the reality of the context, everybody's pushing us. We need to get something that's good. The civilian review board needs to fire the officers. It needs to have subpoena power, all these things. I get into reality and sit across the colleagues on the city council, and every single one of the other 8 at one point or another has been endorsed by the police department and the police union, right? And so I feel like there's also, and not that our dreams shouldn't be big, but there's also the realities in which we live in, and how we organize, and what do we take as so do I say this civilian review board is not enough, it's not gonna fix this, people are still gonna die in Phoenix, or do we make this move to make sure, right? It's the whole reformist conversation. Do we make this move to have a bigger thing? And so I think it's similar when we're talking about international perspectives and working in the immigrant rights movement, having U.S. foreign policy, literally almost, and I visit the cages with the children, and I work with the families, and we find them homes after they get released, and they get asylum questions. Like, I literally work with these folks every week. U.S. policy has direct influence in them coming here, and we're still not even to make that very connection that's there. We're not able to make it. We're not able to advance it in any sort of way to shift policy both internationally, locally, or even as local as Phoenix. And so I just wanted to say, we need some solidarity even within these states before we can start thinking about it. But with the understanding that we do live in the valley of this beast, and we are, even as poor people of color in this country, when we talk to our colleagues in other countries, we are still able and have the privilege to have the fruits of the empire, right? And we are in a very different position, although family's been deported, I've been in gang databases, all these sorts of things are still not the same things that black and brown people and other folks are going through in other parts of the world. And so I think it just goes back to truth, education, and being able to have the understandings of what it is we want.
A follow-up for Carlos, and then to Brandon the same question, which is, do you think that on the local level, immigrant freedom and climate justice combined, that those are maybe the core issues to build bridges between local and global?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, so for climate in particular, to be perfectly frank with you, I think that one's a little tougher on a local level. And I'm just basing it off of the communities that we have to organize in. When you talk about climate, if you talk about climate in the context of environmental issues, children having asthma, and then you have other very toxic waste that comes into our community, the fact that we don't have access to healthy food. You understand what I'm saying? If we're connected to something that's tangible that we do within a local level, I think it can actually help draw that connection. And I think it's difficult to get there. It's just that our local pain is just so intense. Mm-hmm. It's not that it's impossible for people who are working class and poor folks to connect our struggle to our brothers and sisters in Palestine. It's not like they can't do it. It's just more or less like how do I help and protect at the same time, How do I protect my home and advocate for my block kind of mentality? But I do believe that there are issues that are pretty pronounced that on a local level, the national level, and even globally, the community in which I serve and live in can make the connection. Obviously, the interest of education, and we've seen a disruption of education across the globe with privatization, the attack against, public employees. Like, our people get that. They can make those connections, relatively easily. I think the other thing too is the wealthy not doing their part. Like, no one disagrees with that, not even wealthy people. It was always funny when I don't know if you experienced this, Carlos, when you knock on doors in the wealthier parts of your district, and you'll say the wealthy have to pay their fair share, and the rich folks will be like, yes, they do. It's always somebody else. They're never the rich person, right? So I think those connections and opportunities are there. And then, as Carlos alluded to, as we have more practice on a local level, finding commonality, I think that's going to help set us up to build that muscle we've been talking about, to see our struggle in a very global context, so we don't feel as isolated.
Julia, my version of this question for you before we go to Q&A is does Surge, and do you see a possibility of Surge making connections between repression at home and abroad, tying mass incarceration and imperialism together in terms of how racism and this broader racial capitalist order shapes repression everywhere?
I think we're thinking about it as a political education issue, so thinking about how do we have those conversations with people, how do we tie in folks' connections at the local level with the prison-industrial complex to what's been, like, why has the prison-industrial complex been expanded in the way it has, and that is obviously related to neoliberal globalization. But I think for us and where we're at, it makes a lot more sense to meet people at the beginning with these conversations around, like, what's happening in your everyday lives. And getting back to this question around, like, working class white folks and why mobilize them, it's partly because it's strategic and we need to mobilize working class white people, and it's partly because working class white folks are going to have more reason to not want to invest in capitalism, right, when we're on the doors with them. And so we're also thinking about the differences between working class white folks who have a job and so have some income versus like poor white people, and what are people's kind of conditional dependencies on white supremacy, and who would be more likely to disinvest. And so I think at this point, all of us are trying to experiment and figure out what are the conversations that we need to have, what's the rhetoric that's going to move people from where they're at, and then the deeper political education is around how is white supremacy setting us up to be exploited together. And that happens at, obviously, international level. Criminalization of communities at home and abroad is clearly tied to it, but I think where we're at now is really focusing on folks' everyday lives and then expanding and deepening that analysis.
Thank you. Does someone have a microphone out there? Okay, Adam's got it. Any and all questions? In the back. Gabe.
Hi, thank you for that panel. That was That was really interesting, and it's incredible to get to hear all the local stories and perspectives. I have a question about the labor movement and how we should think about the labor movement in this context. We're lucky to be here in a place where there is a mobilized labor movement led by a particular union that both has tremendous economic leverage. When teachers go on strike, it has real effects and they can win that way, and also political militancy and ambition to lead a broader swath of the working class rather than just a kind of more particularistic, getting for their own members. That's obviously not true of most of the labor movement, right? Most of the labor movement either is militant but doesn't have a lot of leverage, or has some leverage but isn't that militant, or overwhelmingly neither, right? And that is, obviously has something to do with miscalculations over the years and years by labor, but is much more due to larger structural problems and vicious attacks and all of this. And that has made labor often not the best ally, right, for many of the movements that we are looking to and are talking about today. But obviously we need it to be, and not just in terms of generating canvassers for our campaigns electorally, but also ultimately to really contest the power of the ruling class in real confrontation, right? We actually need to be able to wield not just votes, but actual leverage. And so I'm just curious how you all have thought about that in the context of the campaigns that you've been involved in and going forward.
It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think we're totally delusional about power if we think that there's some way that, there's no left that could be successful without organizing working people through working people organizations. I don't know, I haven't figured out how that could happen. But the contradictions that you talk about, I think, are legit, and I spend a lot of my time kind of wrestling with that. I think it's nuanced, right? Because not all labor institutions are the same. Not all internationals are the same, and then within them, not all locals are the same. And I think that there's a conversation that's happening within labor. And I think, when a movement or a sector or anything experiences an existential crisis, there's opportunity there. And so labor is, for a number of reasons, there's internal, external factors, there's contending with the changing nature of work, the financialization of the economy, artificial intelligence, automation, all those things that are kind of changing how labor operates. There's internally the fact that there are forces within labor that are attempting to recommit to organizing. And then there's there's a lot of labor institutions that their structures are very rigid. So there's an old guard of people who frankly are just kind of trying to get their pension and not too concerned with these fights. And I think it behooves us to not just be observers, but to be allies with the forces in labor that are attempting to commit to everything, all this set of politics that we talked about. They're there. Many of them are emerging. Some of them, like you said, when there's some locals that those folks are in leadership, and you see how they operate in very different and solidaristic ways. My hope is that that wing of labor could win that debate that's taking place in labor. But not just a hope. I think we all could contribute to that by providing all types of support and aligning with it. And one of the things that, when I talked about the four legs of the stool, and I talked about labor, I wasn't talking in general, I was talking specifically about those forces in labor that would be apt to and interested in throwing down and being in solidarity with social movements, with grassroots forces. I think if we could join with them and then do things like win elections, but do other things with them. But then also there's another relationship. Then we need to show solidarity with them and be on strike lines with them. I think if we do that, then that's a way that we actually could demonstrate solidarity within labor for those forces so that they can win that debate. And I think we must. We must if we want to be successful. But I could tell you all types of stories about why that's super challenging. The coalition that we built in New York, a lot of our comrades in labor, for a lot of transactional reasons, had to distance themselves from us because of the forces that we took on, right? And so that's constantly going to be a challenge, but I don't know any other solution other than us, we have to struggle around it.
So something that I think is important, honestly, you know, the labor movement itself has to just do a better job, you know? And what I mean by that is that the labor movement has to humble itself in community spaces. And I know it's a challenge, it's difficult because, you know, when you are a larger local in particular, sometimes people just kind of defer to you because you have greater access, you have more resources. And there are some needs that you need, particularly politically, that may not always line up with the overall objective of the movement. That is tough. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the labor movement is selling folks out. But there are times when, like in this moment, at some point we're gonna settle a contract. We are. And though we're doing the best that we can, at least the Chicago Teachers Union is doing the best that we can to make sure that we're bargaining for the common good. We have to do better, quite frankly. And I think the onus is really on its rank and file members, and this is where I believe the movement has an opportunity, is that just like you're organizing from the bottom up, it's the same principle that applies in the labor movement. There are rank and file members that you go to meetings with, you go to clubs with, you go to church with, and they might have the same concerns that you have about their union's leadership. So having those conversations with rank and file members is important because that's ultimately where the push is gonna come from. I will just say this last thing, it can be a little convoluted because in my race in particular, I ended up having, and this almost never happens in the labor movement, where this dude that I ran against was so offensive, he managed to piss off public sector and trades. Do you know how hard that is to do? And I was like a very unique situation where I had like the radical left with like HCII, SEIU, home health care workers, teachers unions, and then I had like the building trades. You know, like, and so, you know, I was in a situation where I was able to have broader conversations with our brothers and sisters in the trades and how as we fight for opportunities for Black folks that always don't feel like they have access to the trades, that here you have a public school teacher who is pushing for the trades to be expanded in schools. Trades are saying yay, and then I'm also saying, yo, you gotta hire our people, right? And so it's again having those hard, very truth-telling conversations, but I really believe that there's a lot of responsibility on the part of labor to humble itself. But really, I would challenge folks in this room, if you know of rank and file members within particular locals, bring them to it, you know, conversations like this so that they can help do what we ultimately did within the Chicago Teachers Union, where you took on a structure that had pretty much managed the union for 40 years. It's not easy, trust me. And then even once you assume power, you still have very different dynamics within a local. Like I said, this is Chicago, right? It's a very segregated city. So you got folks who live near me in places of Chicago that are experiencing a lot of poverty. And then we have folks in our rank and file membership that live next door to police officers, while their union is saying the police state in Chicago is problematic. It's tough, but it's a worthwhile fight.
I'll just add that not all labor is the same, right? Like that's the thing we're talking about. You know, I had great experiences with CWA, folks coming out, supporting, we're working together. I see the steel workers right now doing a strike across the border, supporting folks in Mexico, doing solidarity work, doing great work. I had a trades interview for endorsement, and point blank, first question I was asked, are you gonna be with the union or with the illegals, right? What do I answer to that? And like I mentioned earlier, the law enforcement unions actually have the most power where I'm at. They pushed a Blue Lives Matter bill, which became the Officers' Bill of Rights, which is one of the reasons it's been the hardest, it's been the biggest roadblocking for us to advancing anything against police in Arizona. And so I think just recognizing the differences, and also that it's not on us to fix the labor movement. I think that some folks there just have hard heads and have continued to do the same thing that's leading them to an extinction. I did my time. I learned a lot of my organizing at SCIU, UFCW. I was on loan to UFW and did farm worker organizing in the fields of California where Cesar Chavez was at. They're doing the same things, and they're not being successful. And so I think at some point it's not on us to try to, fix the whole thing, but it's also important for us to delineate and know the differences between labor, and also not have this like romanticizing of labor overall, because there is, like in everything, folks that we could be in solidarity with and some that we can't.
And your work in Arizona is a good example of also the need to expand the definition of who labor is and who organized labor is, because the fight to support day labor rights in Phoenix has been a huge part of the struggle over the years.
Yeah, it's the first folks that were attacked, right? And the labor unions weren't there. It was a whole mess. And again, it all obviously race, gender, everything we're talking about. One of the things I failed to mention, when this big anti-immigrant attack hit, and in 2007, the year that Arpaio came out with the ICE powers and all these things shifted, it was literally the first year that more non-white babies were born than white babies. And so I think all that's connected to the conversation.
I would just add, I think if we're thinking about organizations that do good international organizing, sometimes labor is doing some of the best organizing in that. So going back to like United Electric Workers working with Mexican trade unions to oppose NAFTA, and then just international organizing happening, period. That's far from perfect. I think Linda Brennan talks about the difference between our revolutionary imagination and then the world that we live in. Things like what CTU is doing of taking over a union and building out a much more progressive base, working with communities that are impacted, countering this narrative that teachers and students have antagonistic relationships, and really figuring out what does it mean to do this kind of caring work and reproductive labor that teachers do, while also getting paid and also being treated fair and demanding affordable housing and wraparound services and things. So I think there is visionary work. We've got a long way to go, but unions are accountable to a base. I think that's important to keep in mind, and just think about like how do we move their membership.
Aziz.
Yeah. So the question I have is actually about the teacher strike wave and the fact that wasn't just in Chicago, but also in West Virginia and Oklahoma. And so two kind of questions that follow that. One, picking up on Carlos's thought, which is about solidarity in a sense across different regions in the country. And so I'm just curious about, anything about the links between what was happening in Chicago and Oklahoma City and also in West Virginia, if there was organizational activity across the different sites and what that looked like. And then a broader question really about quote unquote red states, which is especially in the wake of the strikes, what are the ways in which the Working Families Party, but also left organizing more generally, has sort of thought about transforming those episodes or moments into concrete institutional forms and then also into electoral politics?
You want to take this shot?
So I'll take just a quick stab at it. So 2012 obviously was one of the first, strikes that we had seen in our country, and this was in 25 years. This is the first one we saw in Chicago in 25 years, especially a major city. And just a little context. Up until that point, the formula that was being used in America that we saw that was most dangerous were states that had Republican governors and Democratic mayors, especially a major city. Chicago was an example with Ronner and Rahm. Of course, you had Cory Booker and Chris Christie. I think Pennsylvania might have had the same thing too with Nutter.
Corbett and Nutter.
Exactly, right. So there was this pattern that seemed to be taking place. So you had basically a very conservative or neoliberal sort of line around essentially austerity, where you take what is for the public good and then you put it into the hands of privatizers, and that you pretty much have disdain for public sector. And up until 2012, to be perfectly frank with you all, not that you all didn't know this, there was no real pushback, from the labor movement. You had Michelle Reed on the cover of Time. I mean, y'all remember all that, like teacher bashing, waiting for Superman. It was just fascinating because I was in the classroom in 2006, 2007, teaching in Cabrini Green. Cabrini Green, just this dynamic historical neighborhood in Chicago, public housing, like literally blocks away from the Gilded Age. So I would, walk to work or take the bus to work, and my students would wake up in the morning and cranes would be staring at them, right? So the same cranes that was destroying public housing was building high-end condominiums. Like you're talking about like a juxtaposition in the dichotomy. Like I walked in that space every single day, but there was no pushback. We just saw it. We knew it was happening, and rank and file members began to, provoke the conversation a little bit more. And though just fast forward to 2012, it really took like rank and file members who pushed against school closings before they took power of the union. And so that's why I think it's really important as we talk about electoral space, you have to build movements first, and then you have to have people who are tethered to that movement, right? Because people are gonna take our platforms like Lori Lightfoot did. I mean, she co-opted, it was brilliant on her part. She said, I'm a progressive too, why not? Right? And it didn't help though that, to Maurice's point, the Democratic Party had been complicit, that's my point. Where some of these characters were responsible for the dismantling of public housing, for the closing of schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think what wave that we're talking about is, I think people realize that like, nobody's coming to save us is the bottom line. And oh, by the way, I'm not a superhero. I'm a black man raised in my black family on the west side of Chicago, trying to get to work, hoping that the kids in front of me learn the 5 causes of the American Revolution. How exciting is that? While living in abject poverty, right? And so like we really had to like wrestle with the fact that in room 309, as exciting as it was to come to Mr. Johnson's class, it's not like their issues went to recess once they came into my classroom. So it was like really provoking those conversations. Here's what I'm getting at. Teachers, this is gonna be very blunt. I know we're live streaming and this sister's trying to protect my political career. And I appreciate that. It's black solidarity. But here's the reality. That you have white educators that are having black experiences. What do I mean by that? They're teaching in poor schools. It's the bottom line. They're teaching in spaces where like even their privilege can't help them. And so you had conversations, not just in Chicago, breaking out in red states, where teachers were like, not only is it a problem in front of me, the students that I'm challenged with every single day to educate, it turns out that my life is pretty jacked up too, right? Where educators are working 2 and 3 jobs, and somehow we think there's a badge of honor when our checking account is withdrawn. Like only teachers feel good about sacrificing their financial interest, right? One of the best experiences I've ever had growing up in my home, someone said, Johnson, who's responsible for your education? I said, my daddy's W-2s. I'm for real, he's 76-year-old. My father's a man of his generation. He didn't talk to us. Y'all know the old black men, he didn't talk. My dad said 3 words a day. Turn the lights out. Turn the heat down. Why did I have so many children? Right? And so like people begin to make these direct connections of not just their lives in front of them, their own experiences, right? Where you have budget cuts, you're not getting raises, the push out of black teachers, the push out of veteran teachers that black and white folks were experiencing, plus having black experiences because children were bringing that poverty into their classrooms. And so white teachers in red states begin to say, look, it's pretty jacked up down here too. And can we say out loud that I'm struggling every single day to make ends meet as a teacher? And there's no glory in that? You got $100,000 in student loans and you're teaching poor children and people are going to make you feel bad because a kid can't figure out a comma splice. As if the comma splice is going to transform and revolutionize their lives, which I did find out when I was 19, what a comma splice was, by the way. And here, $100,000 later in student loans, I'm an expert. But you get the point that we had conversations here in Chicago. Folks begin to have those conversations in other places, and they saw that it was possible. Look, we're still getting like real pushback. This stuff is still hard. 2019, 2012 was about, it was defensive. Let's just stop them from taking over. It's a different posture when you're on the offense. Affordable housing, right? Social workers for every school, counselors for every school, library. So now we're throwing passes. We're not just like playing defense. And so this is the part that's exciting because I think in 2012, we gave a defensive posture. Some of the red states said, we want some of that. We need this, we need this, we need that. And so now you're seeing blue states who've been hit pretty hard around this, who are now on the attack now. And we're on the attack against someone who co-opted our message. What better fight to have right now than someone who claims to be with us, who we know is really not? You gotta expose these mofos. I'm sorry, sister. I'm really making your job really hard, aren't I? Got to expose them. So.
Loco's not too bad.
No, that's right.
Can I respond to directly around the question of red states and how Working Families Party is thinking about it? So I have a friend, Latasha Brown. She runs Black Voters Matter, and like she often says this, and I think it's actually true. It's like there's no red states. There's just unorganized states, right? And you know, when I came on, I had a deep interest in investing in the Southeast just because of the density of millions and millions of Black folks, rural, suburban, and urban, that the Democratic Party has basically ignored because it didn't fit within the Democratic Party's swing state strategy. And like, if you look at the Democratic Party swing state strategy, like so much Democratic Party infrastructure is dumped into swing states. That also unfortunately tracks where a lot of like left organizing infrastructure ends up getting built. And so there's millions of folks who need a political home, and there's just very little infrastructure happening there. And so one of my interests in Working Families Party is over time to build that. So one of the first, one of the emerging states that we're going to be investing in is South Carolina, not because it's an early primary state, but because there's so many issues that are right. Like South Carolina is like out of any state, people in South Carolina have the most personal debt. There's a housing crisis that rivals any other state in South Carolina, and there's South Carolina has millions of Black folks, white folks, and Latinx folks in rural, urban, and suburban communities. So this is a natural site for building that multiracial alignment that we talked about. It doesn't fit the Democratic Party's swing state strategy, so it gets ignored. But if we're actually interested in that and not just helping Democrats win, then we have to invest in places like South Carolina. Alabama has a Democratic senator, albeit he ran against a sexual predator. But to me, that points to the possibility that if we do the organizing, and the other story around that is that we actually invested in the organizing of Black women on the ground in Alabama. That was one of the reasons for that success there. My point being is that if you do the investments in these quote unquote red states, we could win. I mean, there's a revolutionary mayor of a deep red city, Jackson, Mississippi, right? And so we have to, again, have a nuanced, like the same thing with labor, the same thing with these red states. You have to have a nuanced sort of appreciation of these localities, right? And actually like do the engagement. So I'm really excited about engaging around quote unquote red states. It's not gonna happen overnight, it's not gonna happen in one cycle. But folks that thought that Texas was completely like not even worth talking about, Texas is now considered purple, Georgia's not considered purple because of a lot of the investments that took place over the past few cycles. It's just like we need to make the investments in grassroots movements, and we can't just be focused on the proximal electoral victories. We have to be focused on long-term sort of building long-term infrastructure.
On the immigration side, I remember people during that time with Arpaio in 1070, people would come from all over the country. What can we do to help? We'd always say, fight ICE where you're at and fight the expansion, because we were a testing ground. So any law that was attempting to be passed there was going to head to you. And so if ICE is having to worry about not being able to use the gang database here in Chicago, and they're going to have to put more resources here to figure out what they're going to do, that's actually helping the red states. And so I think there is, in that particular area, we were able to have kind of what we called like the on-the-ground fights, and then the beacon cities where we were trying to get, Northeast cities, the Bay Area, all these places to pass kind of policies that ICE or whatever would have to contend there. On the teacher side, my partner, she was the head of her union last year. Well, it's not even a union, so that's the differences. They have to call themselves an association, right to work state. There's all these things, and so they had Arizona. We had a teacher strike for 8 days in 2018, which is phenomenal. It was one right after West Virginia, right? Never thought it'd be possible. Every teacher in the state didn't do, and then for 8 days they were at the state capitol. Our community space happens to be 2 blocks down. We kind of just left it, and we were like, here you go. For these 8 days, this is your home base. You could do whatever. And we were actually able to build some real solidarity there. But the strategies they took, and you're right, you know, it's hard to say from somewhere that's right that, yeah, it's because we're not organized. But the strategies that they took took all power away from them, right? The strategy that got built out of that Red for Ed movement, for the Arizona Red for Ed movement, was a state initiative that was going to force the governor, right, Republican governor, Republican state house, that was going to force them to give more money. That was the only way. That was the only option that was given. And they didn't organize, they didn't do anything. They literally sent every teacher, because the clock was running, they sent every teacher with a handful of petitions to get this on the ballot, right? The governor at that time literally increased the Supreme Court from, I think, 5 to 9 or 5 to 7 and stacked it. As soon as the teachers went out the entire summer, brought back the petitions, that newly kind of stacked state Supreme Court found a way to knock it down. And from then until now, teachers are just they can't trust their leadership because of the strategy that went there, but then no deep popular education. There isn't that tradition of organizing. They don't even call themselves a union, like I said. Left them in probably a worse place than before they took the strike, and without the ability to maybe strike again. And so I think that's where solidarity from other places would be helpful. And then also us, the people of Arizona, the teachers of Arizona, and I'm talking about my partner, if she's watching this, she's gonna come at me when I get home, but is them being able or feel assured enough to take power. And I think that's where, in a more radical place like Chicago, and the example of what's happening now is hopefully going to reinvigorate what's happening there in West Virginia and other places.
Something I would add about the work that you were involved in Arizona that's a powerful example of what can be done in a red state is that the organizing that Puente and the National Day Laborers Organizing Network was doing against SB 1070, the Show Me Your Papers law, wasn't just against that law, but organizers really strategically used this anti-immigrant law that became emblematic of just right-wing Tea Party racism in Arizona to then indict the supposedly liberal Obama administration for carrying out a formally like almost identical program on a federal level, Secure Communities. And that kind of like dynamic that you all pulled off was really what coalesced, I think, the beginning of like a critical stage in building the immigrant rights movement that we have today.
That's correct. Basically what Arpaio was doing when you saw those kids being taken from their family, he asked the federal government for permission to use their ICE database to get people and deport them, right? That's what Arpaio was doing. What 1070 was now the state of Arizona saying Arpaio's doing the right thing, we're gonna force multiply and force every officer to do what Arpaio's doing and ask for documents. At the same time, the Obama administration said, wait a minute, that seems too complicated. What we're gonna do is create this program called Secure Communities and basically digitally just give access to every police department in the country to be able to share information. And so what we were able to do is leverage that and actually say, immigration reform was so far away, we were actually just saying, just stop working with this crazy ass sheriff. Like that's all we're asking. Like we're not actually asking. And now it's funny because the tables are turned. And so for our Democratic mayors, we're saying, don't work with that crazy president. So that kind of goes back